Okay, what we want to take a look at now is protecting the ability to edit an activity. We don't just want any user to be able to edit an activity. We want to just allow the host of the activity to be able to update these fields. Nobody else. And we're controlling who the host is via the create activity. The host isn't going to be able to swap to somebody else. And what we want to do is check to make sure that the attendee is the host before they're allowed to go ahead and update these properties. Now, to do that, we can create a custom authorization policy so that we can check to see if they're the host before allowing them to proceed. And what we'll do, we'll head back to VS Code and we're going to create this functionality. Let's just clean up the tabs at the top, and we'll do this inside the infrastructure project, inside our security. And inside here, we'll create a new class and we'll call it isHostRequirements. And what we're going to do here is we're going to derive from or use the iAuthOrization requirement interface. And we'll need to bring this in from Microsoft ASP.NET Core authorization. And we do not actually need to pass any properties into this. And below this, we'll create another class and say public class is host requirements handler. And we derive from the authorization handler, and we pass in our is host requirements. And then what we should be able to do is implement the abstract class. And this gives us an override method to handle this requirement. Now we're going to need access to two things here. So we'll generate the constructor. So what do we need to inject in here? Well, we need two things. First of all, we need our database. So we're going to inject the DB context. But what we're also going to need to do is get access to the root ID of the activity that we're trying to access, because we need to get the activity ID so that we can check the attendees of that activity from our activity attendee join table and see if this particular user is the host of that activity. Now we can access that information via the HTTP context accessor. So we'll pass in the data context and you bring in using persistence and call it context. And we'll also bring in the HTTP context accessor and call it HTTP context accessor. In fact, we won't call our data context context, we're going to call it DB context, as we also have an authorization handler context here. So we'll call this one DB context, and we'll bring in, using Microsoft ASP.NET Core HTTP, and then we'll initialize our fields from parameter. And we'll do the same for the HTTP context accessor. And let's bring this down. Okay. So we've got our authorization handler context and is host requirement parameters that we can make use of. But let's take a look at what we're actually going to be doing here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get our user ID. So we can get that from our authorization handler context. So we'll say var user equals context, and we've got access to our claims principal, the user object that we've used before. And what we'll use is the find first value. Once again, we've used this before as well. And we'll bring in system security claims. And then we can say claim types. And we're going to look for the name identifier, because we want to use the user's ID in this case, because our activity attendee table, its primary key is made up of a combination of our user ID and the activity ID, and our query is going to be more efficient as if we just try and find the activity by its primary key. So we'll use that, and let's actually call this what it is, which is not a user, it's going to be the user ID. So what we'll do, we'll just check to see if we have the user ID, and if it's equal to null, then we're simply going to return task.completed task. In other words, the user is not authorized. They will not meet the authorization requirement. Then what we'll do is we'll go and get our activity ID. So we'll say var activity ID equals. Now this is a GUID, but in our root value, this is a string. And what we can use to turn our GUID string into a GUID object is we can use GUID, which we'll get from using system, and we'll say .parse, and then we'll use our HTTP context accessor, and we'll get the HTTP context, and we'll add optional chaining here to be safe, and then we'll go to our request, and then from here we can get the root values, and then we can say single or default, and let's bring in system.link to make use of this. And then we can say x goes to x.key, that's equal to ID, and then we get the value from this. Again, the optional chaining, because then we're going to say to string, as the GUID.parse method needs a string. And this should give us the activity ID from the root parameters. What we need to do next is get the attendee object. So we'll say var attendee equals, and we'll say dbcontext.activity attendees, and then we can use the find async methods, and we can pass in the user ID and the activity ID. And because we can't use await inside here because we're overriding this task and we want to return completed tasks, what we'll do is we'll use .results to get the result of this particular query. And this should contain our activity attendee object. And if we don't have an attendee, then we're simply going to return task.completed task once again. And we want to say attendee equals null in this case. And then what we want to do is check to see if the attendee is the host. So we'll say if attendee is host, then we're going to specify context.succeed and pass in our requirements. And then we can say return task.completed task. And if we return at this point and the context succeed flag is set, then the user would be authorized to go ahead and edit the activity. But we're not done yet. We need to go and actually configure this with identity. So what we'll do is we'll go across to our identity service extensions. And inside here, just below the authentication, we'll say services, and we'll say add authorization. And we'll pass this some options, and we'll say opt and add policy. And we'll give our policy a name, which is activity host. And we'll pass in a policy. And we'll say policy.requirements. And we'll say adds. And then we can say new is host requirements, which is the class we created earlier. And we'll bring in using infrastructure security. And just add semicolons to these. And what we're also going to need to do is say services, and we'll say add transient. In this case, we only need this to last as long as the method is running, and we'll pass in the authorization handler and the is host requirement handler. And we'll need to bring in ASP.NET Core authorization. So with this in place, what we can use then is attributes on our endpoints to add this policy. So what we'll do is we'll go to our activities controller. And where we're editing the activity, let's just add an attribute above the endpoint, and we'll say authorize. And we'll bring in ASP.NET Core authorization. And then we can pass in a policy. And we'll set the policy to is, and let's just remind ourselves what we actually called this policy, is activity host. Spelling is important when we're dealing with strings, of course. And we could also put this same policy, even though we're not using it, on our HTTP delete endpoint as well. So now what we should find is that only the host of an activity can edit an activity. And let's go take a look. Now, if I deal with the same activity that we've been working with so far, the one that's got editing activity as Bob the host, let's grab this GUID and let's go ahead and go to the edit an activity as Bob, who is the host. Let's overwrite this particular GUID with the one that we've just got from our get activity details, make sure we're working with the activity where Bob is the host. We want this one to succeed first of all. And if we go and take a look at the body, and let's just update this and click on send, and we get a 200 OK response. And if we go and get the activity details, click on send, aha, well now we've got a problem. Bob has disappeared as an attendee and our host username has been set to null. So what we've done there by adding this requirement has actually messed up our editing of an activity. And of course, if the host username is null and we've removed our attendees, and if we try to edit the activity again, then what we're going to get is a 403 forbidden. So we've introduced a bug into our application by doing what we've done. And what we'll do is take a look at how we can get around this in the next lesson.